Cardboard box I carried out of Mercy General smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. 7 years. That's how long I'd given that hospital. 7 years of overnight shifts, double shifts, holidays I never got back, patients whose names I still remembered at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. And when the budget cuts came, they handed me a manila envelope and a 2-week severance check and told me my position had been eliminated. My older brother picked me up from the parking lot that day. He didn't say much, which I appreciated. He just handed me a gas station coffee and drove. I moved back into my childhood bedroom 3 days later. My father's house was a 40-minute drive from the city, out past the grain elevators and the county road that flooded every spring. He bought the property in 1987 with money he'd saved working construction, and he'd never once talked about selling it. The house needed work. The gutters had been pulling away from the eaves for 2 years. The furnace made a sound every November that made you hold your breath. But it was his, and that mattered to him in a way I understood even if I couldn't fully explain. My sister had moved in 6 months earlier after her second divorce. She'd taken the master bedroom and repainted it without asking. She was standing in the kitchen when I brought my boxes in. She looked at my scrubs. I hadn't had time to change, and she looked at the boxes and she said, "I hope you're not planning to stay long." I told her I just needed a few months to get back on my feet. She went back to scrolling her phone. My father was 68 that year, and his knees were bad enough that he'd mostly stopped going up the stairs. He slept in what used to be the den, in a hospital bed my brother and I had rented for him, and he watched the news in the evenings and complained about the weatherman. He was still sharp, still funny, in the dry, quiet way he'd always been. But something had changed in the last year, a stillness to him that hadn't been there before, like he was saving his energy for something I couldn't see. We had good evenings that fall. I'd make dinner. Nothing complicated, just whatever I could put together from what was in the fridge. And we'd eat together in the den and watch Jeopardy. He was better at the history categories. I was better at science. We didn't talk about my job or my future or my sister's living situation. We just watched television and ate our food and let the autumn come in around us. My sister had opinions about everything except the things that needed doing. She had opinions about the way I loaded the dishwasher, about the brand of coffee I bought, about the fact that I was always hovering around our father, which she said like it was an accusation. But when the pharmacy called to say his prescriptions were ready, she was never the one who drove to pick them up. When the furnace repairman came in November and said it would be $800 to fix, she said that was too expensive and disappeared to her room. I paid for the furnace. I didn't tell my father that, I just told him it was handled. December came, and my father's doctor wanted him to start a new medication regimen that required monitoring twice a day. I learned how to use the blood pressure cuff. I kept a notebook. I drove him to appointments on Tuesdays and Thursdays and sat in the waiting room with a paperback I never actually read, just to have something to do with my hands. My sister bought a new sectional sofa for the living room. It was delivered on a Tuesday while I was at the pharmacy. She put it on a credit card, she said. It was fine. She'd been wanting to update the space. My father didn't say anything about the sofa. He just looked at it for a moment when he shuffled past the living room that evening, and then he kept going. That Christmas, my brother flew in with his wife and their kids, and for a few days, the house felt full in a way that was almost okay. We cooked a big meal. The grandchildren climbed all over my father, carefully, because they'd been coached about his knees. He laughed more than I'd heard him laugh in months. My sister told everyone at dinner that she was thinking about going back to school. She said she had some ideas she was working through. My brother's wife asked what kind of ideas, and my sister said it was too early to say. She didn't want to jinx it. I passed the potatoes and kept my mouth shut. January was hard. My father had a bad stretch, fatigue mostly, some dizziness, and we spent 2 weeks adjusting his medications. I was sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night, checking on him, writing things down, calling the doctor's answering service twice when I got genuinely worried. My brother called to check in when he could. My sister left for a long weekend to visit a friend in Phoenix and came back with a tan. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was fine. February. I found a part-time position at an urgent care clinic 20 minutes away. It wasn't what I'd had before. The hours were scattered, the pay was lower, the work was less interesting, but it was something, and I needed something. I rearranged my schedule around my father's appointments. I ate lunch in my car between shifts. I came home tired in a way that had a shape to it, that I could hold and recognize. My sister asked me one evening in a tone she probably thought was casual whether I was expecting to inherit the house because of all the time I was spending. I didn't understand the question at first. I actually said, "What?" "I'm just asking," she said. "It seems like you're positioning yourself, making sure Dad knows you're here." I stood there in the hallway for a moment. I thought about the furnace. I thought about the 37 Tuesday and Thursday appointments. I thought about the notebook on the kitchen counter with its 4 months of blood pressure readings, meat columns, dates and times, and notes about how he'd slept. I said, "I'm here because he's our father." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and walked back to the living room with her wine. I went to check on him. He was watching the news. I sat in the chair by the window, and we didn't talk for a while. And eventually he muted the television and looked at me and said, "You doing okay, kiddo?" I said I was fine. He nodded slowly, the way he did when he was deciding something. Then he said, "There's a key in the top drawer of my dresser, the small brass one. I want you to hold onto it for me." I asked what it was for. "Storage unit on Route 9, he said. "Unit 14. I've been meaning to deal with it for a while. Haven't gotten around to it." I asked if he needed me to bring something from it, and he said, "No, not right now. Just hold on to the key." So I did. I put it on my keyring between my car key and my apartment key from a place I didn't live in anymore. And I forgot about it mostly, except when my keys jangled and I'd see the small brass glint of it. My father died on a Sunday in March. It wasn't a shock. We'd known for months that his heart was struggling. But it wasn't expected either. Not exactly. He passed quietly, in the night. I was the one who found him in the morning. I won't write about those first hours. Some things don't translate. My brother flew back. There were arrangements to make, and I was grateful to have something practical to do. We notified everyone who needed notifying. We made the calls. We handled the paperwork in the particular numb autopilot that grief sometimes produces, where you're functional and useful and completely hollow inside. My sister cried loudly at the funeral. She stood at the front and accepted condolences with the kind of practiced grief that I watched from a few feet away, feeling something I didn't have a name for yet. The will was read 3 weeks later. A lawyer named Mr. T. Aldridge, not one of us had met him before, came to the house on a Wednesday afternoon. He was a small man in a blue suit who smelled like cedar and seemed uncomfortable with the weight of what he was carrying, though he did his job correctly and without ceremony. My father had divided things plainly. The house and the property would go to my sister. The car, some savings, the furniture split 3 ways between my sister, my brother, and me. And then Mr. Aldrich said there was a separate addendum. He read it slowly. He said my father had designated the contents of a storage unit on Route 9, Unit 14, solely to me. He said my father had left a letter to accompany that bequest. My sister looked up. Mr. Aldrich handed me a sealed envelope with my name on it in my father's handwriting. Then he looked back down at his papers and continued with the procedural language. But I couldn't hear it anymore. I was looking at my name in my father's hand, the same handwriting that had signed my report cards, that had written grocery lists on yellow paper and left them on the refrigerator, that had addressed birthday cards to me for 32 years. I didn't open the letter in that room. I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket and sat through the rest of the reading. My sister, afterward, came to find me in the kitchen. She asked what was in the storage unit. I told her I didn't know yet. She said she thought it was a little strange that he'd made a separate arrangement like that. She said she hoped there wasn't anything that affected the estate, that she'd been counting on certain things, that she had plans. I told her I'd let her know. I drove to Route 9 that evening alone. The storage facility was the kind you see on the edges of small towns everywhere: corrugated metal doors, gravel lot, a security code box at the entrance. Unit 14 was toward the back. The small brass key fit the padlock on the first try. I don't know what I expected. Old furniture, maybe. Tools. The kind of accumulated stuff that piles up in a life. The unit held a metal shelving unit, a folding chair, a plastic storage bin, and two filing cabinets. Everything was neat. My father had always been neat. I sat in the folding chair and opened his letter. He wrote like he talked, plainly, without a lot of ornamentation. He said he'd been putting the unit together for 3 years, a little at a time, whenever he could get out there. He said he wanted me to have it because I was the one who understood that things take work to maintain, and he didn't mean the storage unit, he meant the rest of it. He meant family. He meant the daily showing up that most people mistake for a small thing. He wrote that he knew what I'd done with the furnace. He'd seen the receipt. He said he hadn't brought it up because he didn't want to embarrass me. And then he wrote, and this was the sentence I had to stop and read 3 times. I've never been more proud of anyone in my life. I sat with that for a while. Then I opened the plastic bin. It held documents, neat folders, labeled in his handwriting. A deed to a parcel of land, 42 acres, 12 miles east, a property I'd never heard him mention. A brokerage account in my name, with his listed as grantor that he'd been funding quietly for 11 years. A folder labeled House Repairs that held every invoice and receipt going back to 29, with a sticky note on top that read in case anyone argues about what things cost. A life insurance policy I hadn't known existed. The filing cabinets held more. Correspondence with a financial advisor, copies of tax returns, an inventory of everything in the house with estimated values dated last October. He had been organizing this for years, not because he expected to die, or maybe because he did. In the quiet way older people sometimes accept things they don't say out loud, but because he wanted there to be no ambiguity. He wanted it to be clear. The land alone, I found out later, had been purchased in 1994 for almost nothing and was now worth considerably more. The brokerage account had been growing for over a decade. He had built something real and deliberate, and he had aimed it at me with the same quiet precision he'd applied to everything else in his life. I drove home at 10 o'clock. The house was dark except for the living room, where I could see my sister's light on through the front window. I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. What he'd given my sister was real. The house was a real house. The property was real land, and she could do whatever she wanted with it. He hadn't cut her out. He hadn't written a dramatic letter about her character or what she'd done and hadn't done. He'd just, quietly, over many years, made a separate decision, filed it away, left it for me to find in a storage unit on a county road with a small brass key. I thought about what my sister had said in the hallway, about positioning, about making sure Dad knew I was there. I hadn't been there for the inheritance. I had genuinely never thought about it, not in those terms. I'd been there because when I looked at him sitting in that hospital bed watching Jeopardy and trying to guess the science answers before I could, I wasn't thinking about what I might get eventually. I was thinking about how much I loved that specific person and how none of this time was free. Maybe that's what he'd seen. Maybe you can't fake that, not for years, not through February medication adjustments and Tuesday appointments and furnace receipts. Maybe it just shows. I called my brother that night. I read him the letter. He was quiet for a while and then he said, "That sounds like him." I said, "Yeah." He asked how I was doing and I said I was okay. I said I was going to be okay. The next morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and waited for my sister to come downstairs. She came in around 9, already on her phone, and poured herself a cup without looking at me. I told her I wanted to talk to her about the storage unit. She put down her phone. I could see her calculating whether this was good news or a confrontation or something she needed to manage. I told her what was there. I didn't minimize it or soften it, but I also didn't perform it. I just told her plainly. The land, the account, the documents. I told her our father had been building this for years. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He never told me." I said, "I know." She looked down at her coffee cup. Something moved across her face that was more complicated than what I usually saw there. She said, I knew I wasn't always great to you. When you were staying here, I knew that even then. I didn't say anything, she said. I was scared. After the divorce, I mean. I was scared, and I came here and I made it worse for everyone, and I knew I was doing it, and I did it anyway. She paused. That probably doesn't make it better. I said no, it didn't. But I also said I wasn't trying to ruin anything. That I wasn't going to use what he'd left me as a weapon. That we could figure out how to be sisters again if she wanted to, and that it would probably be slow, and neither one of us would get a pass on the work it would take. She nodded. Not enthusiastically, but she nodded. I picked up my coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the yard, at the oak tree my father had planted when I was 4, at the gutters I still needed to fix before spring. There was a lot of work to do. That was fine. Work had always been the thing I was least afraid of. I thought about the notebook on the counter, all those dates and blood pressure numbers. I thought about a man sitting alone in a storage unit on Route 9, labeling folders in his careful handwriting, making sure I'd be okay after he was gone. Some people show love loudly. My father wasn't one of them. He showed it in receipts and filed documents and a brass key left in a dresser drawer, and in a sentence I keep coming back to even now, when I'm tired, when I'm uncertain, when I need to remember who I'm supposed to be. I've never been more proud of anyone in my life. That's enough. That's more than enough. I folded the letter and put it back in my jacket pocket. Then I went to find the gutter repair kit in the garage because the oak tree was budding and spring was coming and the house needed to be ready. I've thought a lot about what my father actually left me. Not the land, not the account, not the folders and those filing cabinets, though all of that was real and I won't pretend it didn't matter. I mean what he left me before any of that. The 7 years at the hospital, the overnight shifts, the particular kind of tired that comes from caring for someone day after day when nobody's watching and nobody's keeping score. He left me that too, in the sense that he saw it clearly, even when I didn't see myself. There's something I've come to understand slowly. The way you understand most things that are actually true. The life you build in private is the one that counts. Not the version you present at dinner tables or in front of lawyers. The private one. The notebook on the counter. The furnace receipt you don't mention. The Tuesday appointments you show up to even when you're running on 4 hours of sleep and a gas station coffee and nothing else. That's the record that matters. Not because someone will eventually reward you for it. You can't live that way, waiting for the reward, it'll hollow you out. But because it's who you actually are when the performance stops. My sister said I was positioning myself. I was angry about that for a long time. Then I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. And then eventually I understood something. She said it because it was what she would have done. People read other people through the lens of their own motivations. She couldn't imagine being there for any other reason, so she invented one for me. That's not cruelty exactly. It's a kind of poverty, not having enough experience of genuine care to recognize it when you see it. I don't say that to be unkind to her. I say it because I think it's true and because I think it matters. The habits we practice become the instincts we trust. If you spend enough years calculating what you can get from a situation, you lose the ability to see anyone who isn't doing the same. My father understood that. That's why the folders were labeled the way they were. That's why the sticky note on the house repair receipt said, in case anyone argues about what things cost. He wasn't being petty. He was being clear-eyed. He'd watched us both for a long time. What I keep coming back to is this. Nothing I did during those months was strategic, but all of it had consequences. The furnace got fixed because it needed to be fixed, and he was cold and that was reason enough. The appointments happened because he needed to get there, and I had a car, and that was reason enough. Nothing I did was a transaction, and somehow, not through luck, not through calculation, it added up to something. That's not a formula. It doesn't always work out that way, and I know it. But I think there's something real in the idea that how you treat people when there's nothing obvious to gain is the truest information about you that exists. My father collected that information quietly for years. He filed it away in a storage unit on Route 9. And then he left me the key. I think about that key a lot. Small and brass and easy to overlook on a keyring. I carried it for months without knowing what it opened. That seems right to me now. The important things usually don't announce themselves.